assistant professor at Harvard at that time, Henry Kissinger. This is a topic that has been around for a very, very long time, but it isn't always at the top of everybody's political consciousness. It is now, and we're delighted to have Mark here today to talk about the topic, which is refined as nuclear revolutions, how states use nuclear weapons in international politics. He said that he doesn't mind being interrupted for clarificatory questions, but otherwise, please save your questions for the end. Mark.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. I think it's probably a bad sign for the world that so many people are really interested in this topic, but I'm grateful for you all being here. So I'm going to talk about this project that I'm working on, which is going to become a book, but I'm happy to talk in the Q&A and more generally about sort of other nuclear issues that are going on in the world, to the extent that people are interested. So I want to start with this document. So this is a United States National Intelligence estimate that was written in 1963. And the purpose of this estimate was to assess what China would do if China acquired nuclear weapons. Right? China acquires nuclear weapons in 1964, the year after this document. And so people in the US government were interested in trying to figure out, if China were to acquire nuclear weapons, what this would mean for China's foreign policy, for China's behavior in the world. And this document, interestingly, doesn't really come to a conclusion. One paragraph says, we don't think that China acquiring nuclear weapons would produce major changes in China's foreign policy. China wouldn't suddenly become more aggressive. The very next paragraph, though, says something quite different. It says, well, but the Chinese would feel much stronger if they had nuclear weapons. This would be reflected in their approach to conflict. The tone of Chinese policy would become more assertive. What I think this document reflects is that since the arrival of the nuclear era in 1945, US policymakers, and policymakers in other countries as well, have tried to understand how countries acquiring nuclear weapons would change their behavior in the international system. Right? And that continues to this day, right? Debates about how bad it would be if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, if North Korea were to develop certain capabilities, right, hinge on assumptions about how their behavior might change if they were to acquire these capabilities. Right? So if you think, right, that North Korea is going to suddenly become much more aggressive, much more dangerous if they have nuclear weapons, you're going to think that the United States should do more to prevent North Korea from acquiring that capability, and you're going to be prepared to pay higher costs to stop them doing that. Right? And presumably, if Donald Trump says, this won't happen, right? Well, it did happen. But presumably that is based on some assumption, right? Some hypothesis about how bad it would be if North Korea were to acquire these capabilities. And this is basically the question that I ask in this project, that will become a book, hopefully. What effects do nuclear weapons have on the foreign policies of the states that acquire them? And more broadly, right, how do states use nuclear weapons to achieve their political goals in international politics? Because nuclear weapons are a very sort of odd sort of weapon in a lot of ways, right? They're extremely destructive, extremely powerful, right? And we tend to think that more powerful capabilities are more important in international politics. On the other hand, they're very hard to use, right? They haven't been used since 1945, at least directly. Right? So how can we think about how states use these capabilities that are both simultaneously extremely powerful and extremely hard to use directly? And my answer, to give you sort of a preview of what I'm going to argue, is that nuclear weapons are useful in international politics. And this is something that Americans, people in the West, often dislike coming to this conclusion. But the unfortunate reality is, in my view, that for a lot of states, nuclear weapons are profoundly useful tools of statecraft. As a result, they can facilitate a range of different foreign policy behaviors. They can make it easier for states to engage in a range of different behaviors. And I'm going to offer you a sort of theory, a way of thinking about why different states are likely to use nuclear weapons to facilitate different combinations of behaviors. Why different states will use nuclear weapons to do different things in international politics. And then I'll give you some evidence that'll hopefully persuade you that my theory is correct and that the way I'm thinking about nuclear weapons is correct. And then I'll talk a bit about implications. So I'll lay out the question, I'll talk about the precise foreign policy behaviors that nuclear weapons can facilitate. I'll lay out my theory for why different states engage in different combinations of behaviors. I'll talk a bit about how I'm going about testing this theory. Right? I'm going to give you some evidence to hopefully persuade you that my theory is correct, and then I'll draw some conclusions. Okay, so, as I said, the question, what effects do nuclear weapons have on the foreign policies of the states that acquire them? And by foreign policy, I simply mean the sort of strategies and the behaviors with which a state pursues its goals with respect to another state. Right? Now, I'm not the first person to sort of think about this, and to the extent that others have thought about it, you tend to see people falling into two camps. You have a lot of scholars, a lot of thinkers about these issues who say, well, nuclear weapons are basically only good for deterrence. They're good for stopping another state attacking you with nuclear weapons, but beyond that, they're not really useful. Right? So Kenneth Waltz says, concerns about Iran getting nuclear weapons, this is really ahistorical. This contradicts the record of every other nuclear weapon state going back to 1945. The idea being that nuclear weapons haven't really given states much. Right? Stephen Waltz, another famous international relations scholar, says no nuclear weapon state have seen their international status change because they have nuclear weapons. Right? And again, this sort of, you know, if you think nuclear weapons are basically impossible to use, right, then this makes sense. You should think that nuclear weapons won't give a state very much. On the other hand, you have scholars who argue that nuclear weapons are massively emboldening. Right? That once a state has nuclear weapons, they can basically go out, threaten other countries, blackmail other countries, right, kind of do what they want. So Matthew Kroenig argues the spread of nuclear weapons has emboldened their possessors, has contributed to global instability. Jongjin Zhou and Eric Gartsky argue nuclear-capable nations are bound, right, bound to increase their influence in international affairs. The problem, I argue, with all of these arguments is that they ignore the variety that we see in the historical record, right?